My parents kicked me out, told everyone I was sleeping in shelters, then used my $38K savings to buy my sister a new SUV. They called me the son who couldn't stand on his own. They didn't know I still had the doorbell footage that would end their perfect family story. My name is Nathan Cole. I'm 31 years old. At the time this happened, I worked as a property claims adjuster for a mid-size insurance firm in Columbus, Ohio, 7 years in the field. What that means, practically, is that when something goes wrong, whether it's a flood, a fire, or a break-in, I'm the person who shows up with a camera and a notebook and documents what actually happened. Because what people say happened and what actually happened are almost never the same thing. I photograph damage. I trace timelines. I find the gap between the story being told and the evidence on the ground. My parents never thought of my job as something that might apply to them. That was their first mistake. I should tell you about the family first, because the story doesn't make sense without the shape of it. My father, Russell Cole, ran a small landscaping and property maintenance business out of the house I grew up in. A 4-bedroom split level on Arden Drive in Gahanna, about 20 minutes east of the city. He was 55, built like a man who'd worked outdoors his whole life, and he had a version of every story in which he was the reasonable one. Not the villain. Never the villain. Just the reasonable man surrounded by people who couldn't see sense. My mother, Diane, was 53. She handled the business books, ran the church bake sale every spring, and maintained the family's social presence the way some people maintain a lawn, with quiet, constant effort, so that from the road everything looked perfectly kept. She had a gift for sympathy that could turn into a weapon without the shape of it ever changing. She would tell you she was worried about you, and you would walk away feeling worse than before you talked to her. And then there was my sister Amber. Amber was 27. She had her father's confidence and her mother's gift for presentation. She worked part-time at a salon downtown, drove whatever car my parents kept current for her, and lived in the house on Arden Drive rent-free with her boyfriend Kyle, who my father described as finding his footing, and who, in the 3 years I knew him, never appeared to find it. The family line on Amber was that she had a hard start, a rough patch in her early 20s that required support. The family line on me was that I was the one who hadn't needed it. Neither of those lines was entirely accurate. What was accurate was this. I had left the house at 22 and never gone back for more than a Sunday dinner. I built my own job, paid my own rent, paid off my own student loans, on a schedule I kept, in a spreadsheet I reviewed every month. Not because I was particularly disciplined by nature, but because my job required me to understand how things fall apart when people don't keep records, and I decided early that I would not be that kind of case. I want you to understand what the family structure felt like from the inside, because it's the part that made the theft possible. My parents did not think of themselves as people who took from their children. That framing would have horrified them. In their version of the family, they were providers. They were people who gave. They gave Amber a home, gave her a car when hers died, gave her the runway she needed to get herself sorted, and they gave me something they considered equally valuable, which was a reputation of not needing anything. It's a gift that sounds like a compliment and functions like a dismissal. The son who doesn't need anything is also the son who doesn't get asked about, doesn't get a Sunday call to check in, doesn't get included in the planning conversations, because the planning is for the family members who have needs, and he apparently has none. For 9 years I had lived inside that reputation without quite understanding that it had been built for me, brick by brick, so that the family could feel good about looking away. My parents called me self-sufficient and made it sound like a character flaw. The money goes back 2 years before the doorbell camera. When I was 29 and my lease was ending, I'd made a decision to buy. Columbus real estate was moving, I had a solid credit score, and I'd been saving since I was 23, not dramatically, just steadily, the way a person learns to when they can see the difference between what's in the account and what should be there. By the time I started looking, I had $38,000 sitting in a savings account I'd opened at a credit union after college. I did not talk about this money with my family, not out of secrecy, But because I'd learned that financial information shared with my parents had a way of reshaping itself into a request, and then into an obligation, and then into a precedent, all within the span of one phone call. But my mother had been on my account, not my current account. The old joint checking account we'd shared when I was in college, the one I'd used for my first years of work before I opened the credit union account. She'd had access to it for years. I'd never formally removed her because the account had been dormant, empty, and I'd forgotten it existed. I transferred one payment through that old account by mistake. A reimbursement from a coworker routed to the wrong number. $1,200, in and out in 2 days, but long enough for my mother to see the balance. She called that evening. She didn't ask about the money. She said she was calling about Thanksgiving and whether I was bringing anything. The conversation lasted 9 minutes. She asked twice, casually, whether I was comfortable and whether work was going well. It was the kind of question that isn't a question. I know that now. My lease ended in January. I hadn't found the right property yet and needed a place to land for a few months while I kept looking. My mother offered the spare room. 2 months, she said, just until you find something. It'll be nice to have you home. I should have said no. I know that now too. I moved in the first week of February with 3 boxes and a plan to be out by April. The first month was fine. The second month, something shifted. My father started making comments about the house, about costs, about the roof needing work, about Amber's car needing new tires. Not requests, just observations. The way a man drops weight on a table and then looks at you. In March, my mother asked if I could put my savings somewhere more accessible while I was looking at properties, because interest rates were better at a certain bank, and she had a contact there. She said it like she was doing me a favor. I said I'd look into it, and didn't. In April, my father told me I needed to leave. Not rudely, not with anger, with the specific calm of a man who has decided something and practiced the sentence. He said the spare room was needed, that Amber and Kyle were going through a transition, that it was time for me to get back on my feet, on my own. On my own. As though I'd been leaning on them. As though the prior 2 months of paying more than half the grocery bill and fixing the gutters one Saturday afternoon had been something they were doing for me. By the end of the week, I was out. The apartment was ready, and within an hour of moving in, the doorbell camera was up and the house search was back on my list. And then, the calls started. My Aunt Vicky reached out first. She lived in Westerville, a woman I saw twice a year at most, and she texted me on a Sunday to say she was thinking of me and that she hoped I was doing okay. The text had the specific warmth of something rehearsed. I thanked her and didn't ask what she'd heard. Then a cousin on my father's side sent a Facebook message checking in. Then a woman from my parents' church, who had never once reached out to me in my adult life, left a voicemail saying she was praying for me. I started to understand the shape of what was being said. My mother had told people I was struggling, not that I'd moved out, that I'd been asked to leave because I couldn't manage on my own, and that I was sleeping somewhere without a stable address. Possibly in my car, possibly somewhere worse. The phrase I eventually heard through my cousin's wife, who didn't know to be careful about what she repeated, was sleeping in a shelter. My mother had told her church circle that her son was sleeping in a shelter. I was in a clean 2-bedroom apartment with a parking space and a doorbell camera. I want you to sit with the precision of that for a moment, because it wasn't vague. It wasn't Nathan's going through something difficult. A shelter is specific. A shelter is a destination you arrive at when everything else has run out. It is a place people picture when they close their eyes. My mother had chosen that word and put it in a room full of people who would carry it home with them. And she'd done it without my name explicitly attached, which is the more experienced version of a lie. The kind where if anyone ever pushed back, she could say she'd only been expressing a mother's worry. She hadn't said his name. She'd simply described a son who couldn't stand on his own feet. The story was not accidental. A woman who runs the church bake sale and maintains her family's social presence does not casually tell a circle of church friends that her son is in a shelter without understanding exactly what that does to the family narrative. It made Amber's situation look temporary and reasonable by comparison. It made my absence from Arden Drive look like evidence of failure rather than the simple act of a man who'd moved out when he was asked to. And it created sympathy for them. I want to tell you what that felt like, because I think it's the part people don't always name. It wasn't anger, not exactly, though anger was underneath it. What it was, more precisely, was a specific kind of cold. The kind that comes when you understand that someone you loved spent time, actual time, constructing something untrue about you. Not in a moment of carelessness, with intention, with audience selection, with the particular care of a person who understands how reputation works in a community where everyone goes to the same church and sits at the same potlucks, and whose sympathy, once given, is hard to reclaim. She had built a version of me for that community, a son who fell apart when he left, a cautionary lesson about what happens when a child pulls away from family. And every check and text I received, every voicemail with the soft voice and the prayers, was that version of me living in someone else's phone, someone else's head. I sat with this for 2 weeks. I'm not a person who reacts fast. My job trains you out of that impulse. You don't close a claim in the first hour. You gather. You verify. You build a picture that holds up when someone pushes back on it. So I gathered. The credit union told me something was wrong before I could ask them directly. I had set up a low balance alert on my savings account. Anything below $30,000, I'd get a text. The kind of automation that runs in the background and doesn't feel important until the moment it does. On a Thursday morning in June, my phone buzzed while I was on a site visit. The balance had dropped to $29,400. I drove back to the office. I pulled the account on my laptop and looked at the transaction history. There had been a transfer 3 days earlier, $8,000 out. Then, 2 weeks before that, $11,000. And 6 weeks before that, a smaller one, $4,200. The transfers had gone to a third-party account through an authorization that appeared to use my login credentials. My old login credentials. The ones my mother had watched me enter once, 2 years ago, when I'd shown her how to check whether a reimbursement had cleared, because she'd asked me to walk her through it. I sat in the parking lot outside my office and kept my hands flat on the steering wheel for a long moment. Not because I was shocked, exactly, because I was doing what I do at every scene. I was slowing down. The total missing was $23,200. The remaining balance was $14,800. $38,000 minus $23,200. I did the math twice, which is also something I do. Habits from the job. I called my credit union's fraud line and told them I had unauthorized transfers. They began an investigation the same day and froze outgoing transactions on the account. The investigator's name was Philip Torres. He was methodical and unhurried, and he asked exactly the right questions about who had observed my login details. Then I called Veronica Haynes. Veronica was a civil attorney I'd worked alongside on a property fraud case 2 years earlier. She wasn't a close friend, but she was precise, and she had the specific quality I needed right then, which was that she didn't make things bigger than they were. She just told you what the situation was. I told her everything. The unauthorized transfers, the shared credential history, my mother's access to my old account, the shelter story being circulated at church. Veronica listened without interrupting, and then asked 2 questions. First, did I have any documentation of the original $38,000 balance? Yes, I said. I had 6 months of statements saved to a folder I kept for tax preparation purposes. Second, had I looked at my parents' recent spending? I hadn't. She told me to look. I didn't have access to my parents' accounts. But there are things you can see from the outside when you know where to look. My job had taught me that. You can't always see the inside of a claim, but you can see what the claim is connected to. Amber's social media had been public for years because Amber was the kind of person who documented her life for people she'd never met. In September, 6 weeks after the first unauthorized transfer left my account, she posted a photo in front of a new black SUV with a bow on the hood. The caption said, "Best parents ever." The comments were full of hearts. My mother had commented, "You deserve every bit of this, baby girl." The SUV was a current model. The bow was the kind dealerships put on when someone pays full. The dealership was visible in the background of the photo. The model was identifiable. A few minutes of research confirmed the pricing. The base cost of that vehicle, without add-ons, was $34,000. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I opened a new folder on my desktop and named it correctly, the way I name all my case folders. Date first, then subject. October, Cole family. The doorbell footage I'd forgotten about until my attorney asked me a simple question. Veronica had suggested, as a parallel track to the fraud investigation, that I document any physical access to my property. Had anyone from my family come to my apartment? Had any mail gone to my parents' address that shouldn't have? The motion alerts on my phone had been dismissed as habit. The dog, the delivery drivers, the squirrel. But the app kept a full archive, not just the 12-hour loops. That night I opened it and scrolled back 7 months. On a Tuesday in June, the same week as the first large transfer, there was a 47-minute window of footage. My mother's car in the lot. My mother walking up the exterior stairs to my landing. My mother standing at my door for a moment, then trying the handle. The door hadn't opened. She'd tried twice, and then she'd left. She hadn't knocked. I watched it 4 times. Then I sent the clip to Veronica. What this proved by itself was limited. It proved she'd come to my apartment and tried the door. It proved she'd done it the same week $23,000 moved out of my account. It didn't prove she'd made the transfers. That was the bank's investigation to make. But it proved something else, which mattered to me in a different way. It proved she had been here. It proved she had come. Quietly, without telling me. Without knocking. And it meant the story she'd been telling, that she was worried about me, that she was simply a concerned mother sharing her fears with her church circle, was not the whole story. A woman who is simply worried about her son does not drive to his parking lot on a Tuesday afternoon and test his door handle in silence. This was not worry. This was reconnaissance. I sent Veronica everything. The statements. The archived footage. The transaction records the credit union had already begun to trace. And then I waited, the way I wait on complicated claims, with the knowledge that the evidence does the work if you let it. The family gathering that October had been planned since August, my parents' 30th wedding anniversary. My mother had put it in the family group chat, and my Aunt Vicky had offered to host. 30 years, the message said. We want everyone there. I had not responded to the group chat in 6 weeks. Veronica had advised me to attend, not because of any legal strategy, but because the alternative, my continued absence, let my parents keep writing my chapter. If I wasn't in the room, the shelter story had no one to contradict it. The family had been getting one version of me for 7 months. Veronica thought I should let them see another one. I agreed with her reasoning. I also made 3 copies of every document before I left the apartment. 1 set in a folder in my bag, 1 set in the glove box of my car, 1 set emailed to Veronica's office with the subject line, Cole family, complete package. I drove the 20 minutes to Aunt Vicky's house in Westerville on a Saturday afternoon in October. The sky was that particular Ohio gray that arrives in fall and stays until April. I parked in the street, sat for a moment with the folder on the passenger seat, and went in. The house smelled like my aunt's cooking and the specific floral candle she kept in her entryway. About 20 people. Cousins I recognized, a few I didn't. The couple from my parents' church who'd been at every family event since I could remember. My father stood near the kitchen with a plate in his hand, already talking to someone's husband about something involving square footage. My mother was at the dining table with Amber, who was wearing the kind of outfit you wear when you want people to notice you haven't changed sizes. No one said anything when I walked in. A few cousins looked surprised. My Aunt Vicky touched my arm and said she was glad I came. The church couple looked at me with that same particular softness, the slightly tilted head warmth of people who'd been told a sad story about me and were now cataloging the evidence. The food table was near the window, and I went there, filled a plate, and sat in the nearest empty chair. My mother came over within 5 minutes. She bent down slightly, the way she does when she wants a conversation to feel private, and she said it was so good to see me and asked how I was getting along. She said getting along the way a social worker might. Gently measuring, "I'm well," I said. "Thank you for asking." She patted my arm. She went back to the table. My father didn't come to me. He stayed in the kitchen and occasionally glanced over with the particular look of a man who has decided on a position and is not interested in complicating it with new information. Then, about 40 minutes in, my cousin's wife made the comment that opened the floor. She was standing near my aunt's china cabinet with a glass of wine, and she said, loud enough for the cluster of people around her to hear, that she was glad Nathan had found somewhere stable, and she hoped things were on the upswing. She said it with the warm, general confidence of someone repeating a thing they'd been told and had taken as settled fact. The room had a moment of that particular quiet that means people have heard something and don't know whether to engage with it. I put my plate down on the coffee table. Not fast. I set it down deliberately, the way I set a camera down at a scene when I'm ready to start documenting. I want to tell you something before I tell you what happened next. I don't enjoy confrontation. I'm not built for it the way some people are. My father is built for it. He's the kind of man who raises his voice and considers it a form of clarity. My mother is built for it in a different way. She doesn't raise her voice, she simply repositions the story until you find yourself apologizing for the wrong thing. What I am built for is documentation. I'm built to let the record do the work. And the record, that afternoon, was in a folder in my bag by the front door. I stood up. I said loud enough that it carried, that I wanted to take a moment to clear something up, since several people in the room seemed to have some concern about my situation. The room got quiet. The kind that means people are deciding whether to look. Not in a shelter, I said. Never had been. 7 months in a 2-bedroom apartment, and before that, looking at properties to buy with $38,000 saved over 6 years. My mother said Nathan quietly. A warning in 1 syllable. I said I'd like to finish. I walked to the door and picked up the folder. I came back to the middle of the room and put it on the coffee table beside my plate, and I sat back down. I opened it, not theatrically, just the way you open a folder when you need to refer to it. The first thing I put on the table was a printed bank statement, 6 months old. It showed the savings account balance at that time, $37,840. I said that was what I had saved before the unauthorized transaction started. My father set his plate down. He said, "What transactions?" I put the next page on the table. Transaction history, highlighted in 3 places. 3 transfers, totaling $23,200. All of them traced by the credit union's fraud team to login credentials that matched the device history of a phone registered to a Gahanna, Ohio address, my mother's address. The room was very quiet. My Aunt Vicky sat down in the chair nearest her. The church couple, standing near the bookshelf, both looked at each other without speaking. Amber said, "That's not," and then stopped. I put the 3rd page on the table. It was a printout of the social media post. The SUV. The bow. Best parents ever. Amber's caption. My mother's comment underneath. I said the vehicle in the photo retails at $34,000, and that the first unauthorized transfer from my account occurred 6 weeks before the purchase date visible in the dealership's public records. I wasn't raising my voice. I was using the same register I use on every site visit. Measured, precise, letting the page carry the weight. My father started to speak, and my mother put her hand on his arm. Not to stop him, to hold herself steady. I said there was one more thing. I put the last page on the table. It was a still frame from the doorbell footage, time-stamped. My mother's car in my parking lot. My mother at my door. The handle angled, the way it angles when someone is trying it. I said that was Tuesday, June 11th, the same week as the first large transfer. The room didn't erupt. That's what I want you to understand. It didn't turn into shouting and drama. What happened was something quieter and more complete. My Aunt Vicky put her hand over her mouth. One of my cousins, a man named Owen who I'd grown up playing in the backyard with, picked up the transaction page and read it twice, and then set it back down without a word. The church couple near the bookshelf both took one step back, as though creating a physical distance from my parents. My mother was crying. I don't know when it started. I only noticed it when she made a sound. She said, "Nathan, we were going to pay it back." She said the business had a bad quarter. She said she'd meant to tell me. She said Amber needed something to get back on her feet, and that she knew I'd understand eventually. Understand. I looked at her for a moment. The room waited. Then she kept talking, which is the thing she does when silence becomes unbearable. She said I had always been the one who didn't need anything, that I was capable and independent and she'd raised me that way and I should be proud of it. She said Amber's situation was different, that Amber struggled in ways I'd never had to, that a mother sees her children differently and responds to them differently, and that wasn't favoritism, that was just knowing your family. She said the business hadn't had a good 2 years, and she and my father had been under strain I couldn't imagine, and that the money had been temporary, and that she had always intended for me to have it back, every dollar of it. She said all of this without pausing. The words came out in a practiced rush, the kind that happens when someone has been preparing for a conversation they knew was coming. And underneath all of it, underneath the bad quarter and the strain and the always intended, was the structure of a justification she'd been building since June. The story where she was reasonable and I was the son who didn't need support, and so taking from him was a kind of efficiency rather than a crime. Amber had been given a car. I had been given the role of someone who could absorb the loss. I had one question. Just one. I said, "What did you tell people about where I was living?" The room had been drifting, as rooms do during a long explanation, people looking at the papers, or at each other, or at the floor. But the question brought it back. Because it was specific, because it didn't argue with any of the things she'd said about the business or the intentions. It was just a question about a fact. My mother looked at me. Her eyes were wet, and there was still the performance of grief in them, the particular wounded arrangement of a woman who expected to be believed on the strength of it. But underneath that, something was calculating. She said she had only shared her concerns, that she was worried about me, that she'd told people she wasn't sure where I was staying. My cousin Owen's wife, standing near the bookshelf, said quietly that wasn't what she'd heard. Everyone turned to her. She was a careful woman, not inclined to conflict. She said she'd been told I was at a shelter, that those had been the words. A shelter. The room went to a different kind of quiet. My mother said she didn't remember saying it that way, that people sometimes heard things differently. I let that answer sit in the air for a moment, the way you let a number sit on a page before you draw a conclusion from it. I said, "And that's your correction." She didn't answer. My father said we should all calm down and talk about this like adults, which is what he says when the reasonable man position has been made unavailable to him. My cousin Owen said he thought he needed to hear my mother answer the question. She didn't answer. She looked at the table with the papers on it, and she put her face in her hands, and she sat like that for a long time while the room held its particular silence around her. Here is what I want to tell you about that silence. It was not triumphant. I know people expect the anger, the release, the feeling of something long overdue arriving at last, and there was some of that. But mostly what I felt, sitting in my aunt's living room with the folder open on the coffee table, was tired in the way you get tired when a case finally closes. Not happy tired. Just the specific emptiness that comes when you've been carrying something heavy for 7 months and you're finally allowed to set it down. Amber had not spoken since her one truncated sentence. She was sitting in the corner chair with her arms crossed and her eyes on the window. Kyle, who had arrived late and was still in his coat, was standing near the back of the room with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who wanted very much to be in a different room. My father tried twice more to redirect the conversation. He said the bank investigation would work itself out. He said this was a private family matter. He said a lot of what he said was taken out of context. Owen asked what context changes a bank record. My father stopped talking. The fraud investigation concluded in November. The credit union determined the transfers were unauthorized and made under fraudulent pretenses, accessed via compromised credentials. They restored $23,200 to my account. The documentation I'd provided, combined with the device and IP address trail the fraud team had assembled, was submitted to law enforcement. My parents were not charged. I want to be clear about that. A civil settlement was reached, quietly, with Veronica's help, in which my parents signed an agreement acknowledging the transfers and agreeing to restitution of the full amount through their business account. The agreement included a confidentiality clause that covered the terms but not the fact of the situation, which is why I can tell you it happened. The restitution came in 3 installments. The first arrived by bank transfer in December, the second in January, the third in March, and it was 3 days late, which Veronica noted and documented, because that's the kind of thing that matters later, if it ever needs to matter again. Each transfer came from the business account of Cole Landscaping and Property Maintenance, and each one landed in my savings account, without a note, without a message, without anything that acknowledged what it was. Just numbers moving from one account to another, the way money moves when nobody wants to name what they're paying for. The SUV could not be returned. It had been titled. There was nothing in the settlement that addressed it, because the settlement was about my money, not Amber's car. Amber kept the car. She also stopped speaking to me, which I expected and did not grieve. My mother sent me an email 3 weeks after the gathering at my aunt's house. It was long. It contained the word circumstances 7 times, which I know because I counted. It contained an explanation of the business's financial difficulties, a history of what she called the sacrifices they'd made over the years, and, near the end, a sentence that said she hoped I could find it in my heart to understand that what they'd done came from a place of trying to hold the family together. $23,000. In exchange for the family story where Amber thrives and Nathan couldn't stand on his own. I did not reply to the email. I saved it the way I save everything, to the Cole family folder on my desktop, where it sits alongside the transaction records and the doorbell still and Veronica's correspondence. Not because I plan to use it, because it is the truth of what happened, written in my mother's own words, and the truth should be kept somewhere it doesn't get rewritten. My father did not write. He's not a writing person. He's a person who makes things make sense in rooms, and I'd remove the room where that skill worked for him. There were ripples from the gathering that I hadn't fully anticipated. My Aunt Vicky called me the following week, and the week after that, and then it became the first Sunday of every month, with the natural ease of something that should have been happening already. She didn't explain why she was calling or what she now understood. She just called. We talked about ordinary things, the weather, her garden, a novel she was reading. But the quality of the conversation had shifted in a way I can't easily describe, except to say that she stopped using the tilted head softness. She talked to me the way a person talks to another person, not the way a person talks to someone they've decided is fragile. Owen texted. Then called. Then, over the course of 3 months, became someone I talked to with some regularity, which had not been true before. He never mentioned the gathering directly. He didn't ask me how I was doing in the particular way that means they've heard a story about you. He just talked, the way cousins who grew up in the same backyard should be able to talk when no one has been managing the narrative between them. What I did that month was finish buying the house I'd been looking for. A 3-bedroom in Clintonville, 12 minutes from work, with a front porch that needed a new railing and a backyard that backed up to a small creek. I closed in December. I moved in before Christmas with the same 3 boxes and a few more pieces of furniture. On the first night, I set up the doorbell camera again. Same brand as the last one. $43. I angled it toward the front walk this time, checked the app twice, and went to make dinner. It's been 8 months. There's a hardware store 2 blocks from the Clintonville house, and I'm in it more than I expected. New owner, a man named Grant who's been there 12 years and knows the stock the way some people know a language. He doesn't ask what you're building. He just shows you what you need. I bought the railing hardware there in January, and we spent 20 minutes at the fastener wall while he explained the difference between 2 nearly identical lag screws in terms I could actually understand. That conversation, a Tuesday morning in January, in a fluorescent-lit hardware store with a stranger who had no opinion about my family, was one of the better 20 minutes I'd had in a while. I don't know how to explain that except to say that sometimes ordinary, uncomplicated things become very valuable when you've been inside a complicated situation for a long time. My Aunt Vicky calls me on the first Sunday of every month, which she did not do before October. Owen sent me a text in January when he got a promotion, and when I responded, kept the conversation going for 20 minutes, longer than we'd probably talked in the previous 5 years combined. The church couple did not reconnect with me. I didn't expect them to. My parents and I don't speak. That isn't a wall I put up, exactly. It's more that the architecture of our relationship was built on a particular arrangement, one where I was the problem-free child, the self-sufficient one, the son who didn't need anything, and could therefore be expected to give everything. That architecture doesn't stand anymore, because I'm the one who documented what it was actually made of. Amber texted me once, in February. She said she hadn't known about the transfers. She said she thought the car was a gift. She said Mom told her they'd been saving. I read the message twice, and then I put the phone down and thought about it for a while. The thing is, I don't know whether that's true. I genuinely don't know whether Amber understood where the money came from. It's possible she didn't. It's possible she did, and has spent the last 8 months finding a version of the story where she's the one who didn't know. The doorbell footage is very clear. The transaction records are very clear. What people told themselves in the space between those 2 things. I can't document that. I never responded to her text. The house is good. The railing on the front porch needed considerably more work than I had expected, which is always the way with older properties, and I was glad for it. I spent 3 Saturdays on it in January with a level and a box of hardware, and the particular patience you develop when you understand that doing something right takes longer than doing it fast. The doorbell camera clips at the front walk have so far recorded my neighbor's retriever, a UPS driver who rings the bell even for packages that don't require a signature, and a pair of cardinals that apparently find the motion alerts personally offensive. Nothing else. No midnight reconnaissance. No familiar cars in the lot. I keep the folder in my desk drawer. The folder with the statements and the screenshots and the single still frame of a woman standing at a door she believed was empty, trying a handle she believed would give way. I don't open it often. It doesn't serve a function anymore the way it did. But I keep it, the way I keep every closed file, because the documentation is the truth, and the truth is the only thing that holds when everything else has been rewritten. They called me the son who couldn't stand on his own. I'm standing. The house is mine. And somewhere in a parking lot in Gahana, a woman's face is still on a timestamp, frozen at the moment before she realized the door was locked. If this landed somewhere real for you tonight, you already know what it's about. It's not about the money. The money mattered, but the money was recoverable. What they tried to take that wasn't money. The version of yourself that a family decides for you. The story they tell while you're not in the room. That's what takes longer to get back. If someone in your life is writing your story without you, that's your sign. Find the footage, keep the records. Drop a comment and let me know you were here. Subscribe for the next one.